You're listening to Unscripted, and I'm your host, Nell Daly. I have built a media agency. I'm the founder of Well and Being Global. I do lots of TV commentating because I'm both a journalist and, ironically, a formerly trained psychotherapist. And I know, there's another and. I'm a single mom with 3 kids. So bottom line, if I can do a lot of what we're talking about on this program, then you can do it too, for sure. I'm here to answer your questions and inspire you, keep you motivated, introduce you to some really, really cool people, and hopefully entertain you. Because in the end, here's the deal, guys. As the late John McCain once said, and I'm quoting roughly here, serving others gives your life a special meaning. And that's pretty much the truth I've built my whole entire existence around. We would love for you to do 2 things for us this week. If you could follow us on Facebook at Nell Gibbon Daily, that's my fan page, and on Instagram at Nell Daily, that would be huge. The bigger the followings, the bigger the guests. That's just how it goes. And 2, if you could review our show on iTunes, I would be forever grateful, and I'll do a huge shout out to any new reviews that come my way. I will put a link on my Instagram profile on how to do these simple tasks for us. If you could all take 3 minutes of your day, it would mean the world to myself and my team. Today's guest is Jess Lively, who has a podcast called The Jess Lively Show, which is all about how to live with intention, concepts involving spirituality, and she talks quite extensively about consciousness. I've been listening to her for a few years now. She's a graduate of the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business, and her podcast has had over 10 million downloads. She now travels the world teaching. Having Jess on was like a dream come true to me. Honestly, to rap openly about things like channeling, flow states, and definitions of enlightenment was incredible. She's honest and raw, and the conversation took me to a place I didn't expect. Jess is brave to talk about her beliefs so openly. You're going to hear some of my experience as well that may for some be a bit woo-woo. I suggest you go back to some of my very first episodes that I've done on Unscripted, and you'll get a better sense of my journey and who I am and where I'm at. We speak quickly, and you're going to hear 2 women trying to articulate some very complex topics. In particular, we challenge the popular stereotype of what an enlightened person looks like. Usually it's, if not always, a man. We also challenge what it means to be enlightened, what we think it must feel like if you are enlightened, and what Jess means when she says she wants to live almost completely out of her head. Hold on. This one's a ride. So at the time, I had another patient who was sort of evolving at the same time, at the same space. And she said, Nell, you've got to listen to Jess Lively's podcast.
Oh, nice.
And of course you were there. And so here's the thing that I love for those of you who've never listened to you before. There's actually, we think that there's a lot of support for people who are awakening, and there's not. And so,
I mean, there's a lot of older things out there that have been written thousands of years ago and then interpreted by people that don't have the same level of consciousness that created that. So yeah, there's not as much, but there's more than ever before. I think it's emerging.
I think there is. And I think though, it's really beautiful to come across somebody who is a well-read, credible source. So I think when people start going into this sort of like idea of the woo-woo, or you start talking about it, especially if you're a clinician, you're incredibly well-read, right? Like you've studied this, you live it, you breathe it, it's what you do. And I really appreciate that because I'm an intellectual, I'm analytical, I have a very formal education, I have an incredibly conventional background. And so I need a little bit of the science to keep me going. And I also don't feel like there was a lot of women out there, texts that I turned to when I was awakening, right? We had like Eckhart Tolle, and I sort of, Untethered and all of these books, but it felt very male dominated to me.
It is. I mean, it's not. I don't actually, ironically, to that point, this is all very non-results oriented. There's no statistic I can quote about this, but it's a generalization and possibly not right, but what I've kind of felt or heard, even from someone like Eckhart, is that more women, it's more accessible, that realization of enlightenment for women. But yes, documented teachers of that type of material definitely is more male heavy. But that said, that may not mean that more women haven't had the experience of it.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Totally.
So there's more male teachers, but maybe not actually more male experiencers of the experience. Possibly. And there's no stats to quote that.
Of course. So we all can experience or may have experienced equally an awakening, whatever, male, female, gender neutral, anything you identify as. But it's right. When I first was going through this, all the texts that were being thrown at me as I looked on my desk, I was like, damn, these are all men. And here's the other thing I found, which I really appreciate about your podcast, is that I was an English major in college. I have an MFA from Columbia in creative writing. So I've studied literature my entire life. I struggle when I read Virginia Woolf. I struggle sometimes when I read Shakespeare, but I can get through it. And some of the texts, I really have found that not only were they not relatable, but I had a difficult time interpreting them. And I'm like, wait a second, I'm a highly intelligent person. And some of the really popular ones, I'm going to say it, The Untethered Soul. I read it. I went away for a weekend. I took all of his books and I sat down with them and I was like, and it wasn't necessarily the content that wasn't resonating. It was the language in which it was told and the story in which it was told. It still felt, God, I'm sorry to say this, but it still felt like I was coming from this male voice. And there's Jess Lively steps in.
Yeah.
Kudos to you. I mean, I don't know if you felt that before. And I know I actually was listening to one of your podcasts this morning and you were talking about how, when, go back to some of the other things that, other episodes that I've done and reread these texts, because sometimes at one point in your life when you're reading them, maybe you're not totally ready for the information or they don't resonate with you in the same way. And then you go to them at another point and you're like, oh, okay, I get it. And now I understand them better.
Absolutely. I've been rereading The Power of Now after 10 years, about 7 times. I read it for a period of about, 4 to 7. I wasn't counting the times. It was just on this repeating cycle. And that was coming after 10 years of taking a break from it. And ironically, my podcast episode cover, the new show cover has the cover of The Power of Now and A New Earth. But funny enough, when I did that photo shoot, those are just new books I happened to have alignment in buying at the time. And a photographer had the idea for the books near me. And I remember afterwards, this is before a shift that happened for me in April. So this photo shoot happened in February. And I remember thinking, people are going to think I'm a beginner. I'm holding The Power of Now. I'm so far beyond that. And that was because there's the hubris of the ego of myself, thinking that 10 years ago, I got all there was to get out of that book. And once I reread it after that photo shoot and then had a shift in my own level of experience of consciousness, rather, I then realized the joke was on me, the mind that thought it was beyond what was there all along and kind of started my path. So it's super funny now to go, the humility to actually re-explore content you've already created or experienced in the past, as you are different, you see differently. And it's a difference for me. The experience was different in that it went from being a student of a master to kind of student teaching. Studying it now is more like student teaching. I'm not a realized master like he is at the moment, but I can say I understand far more, but I'm the student teacher. I'm learning from him now. When I read it, I'm reading it as a student teacher rather than a student, which is a very different experience of content. And
Well, it's so interesting because as we get into the podcast world and given what I've done for a living, which is basically doled out life advice, for better or worse,
likewise,
maybe people should think twice about taking.
You have way more degrees than I do.
Well, that's the interesting thing. That is so interesting because one thing I've really been impressed with and sort of both impressed with and struggled with a little bit is that, for people who aren't formally trained, I'm like, damn, they give they're just totally unafraid to give all this advice to people. I think
the training, honestly, to me personally,
yes.
I went to business school at the University of Michigan, Ross School of Business. And when I was in school being trained at one of the most prestigious, important, or competitive, whatever, best ranked business schools, when I saw the content we were learning and the students that were taking it and how they were approaching it and their level of, I don't know, I guess I could call it intelligence. I wouldn't call it consciousness, but maybe they're kind of combined. I was like, this is BS. This is what makes someone smart or worth being in I completely felt this disillusionment with authority figures aligning certificates to someone. I now no longer give any crap whatsoever, because to me, the traditional education system is already archaic in itself. But I want to know from the person, I want to resonate with the source. I care zero about their training. And I think that has been something from that early experience of business school, something that stuck with me. So I don't care if someone's gotten actually sometimes at some circumstances, I actually think that those certificates can actually be masking actual ineptitude. Like they're using that to compensate for their own lack of innate ability to perform. Does that make sense?
Oh, and I also think completely. And I totally agree with you. I think in my field in particular, what's hard is that we're actually trained very hardcore not to share ourselves.
Coaching does also a similar thing. I'm not trained as a life coach though, so but I do know also traditional life coaching does a similar model, not to share much of yourself.
Right. Well, and you go to, I have postgraduate training in medicine and, from a very traditional psychoanalytic institute in New York City. And, you're when I see people sharing, whether they're credentialed or not, I'm like, damn, that's so brave, right? Because I've been trained to sort of put myself in the back burner, and that's not sort of what you do. And so what's really been refreshing for me again about listening to your podcast is how you've moved from, you said recently, I don't want to be, I'm not counseling isn't my jam anymore as much as teaching. And so that's where you can step in. And after a certain point in your life, when you've done sort of a lot of the work, you want to teach. That's the next evolution of your own process. The other place where I get tripped up in this is the idea that the more I learn, the less I know. So whenever I give advice to people or say anything about spirituality, I'm like, I don't know though, dude.
I feel the same way.
You know what I mean? And I'm I'm just giving you kind of my perspective, but I don't know. I know nothing. I actually really know nothing. So
no, I completely agree. I think that the bounds of the borders feel very confined and defined the less you know. And the more you know, the more you open up. And the more you open up, the more you realize the more there is. And therefore, the less you then know. You realize how much bigger the field actually is than the little pen that you've been stuck in behind.
Yeah, big time. So I have a couple questions for you, definitely. Yeah. I was really glad to see you back, because when I heard the podcast, and I'm sure you've gotten this 1,000 times over, everyone was I was listening to that on a run, and I went, no, no, that doesn't work with my alignment, Jess. You can't stop the show.
So many people said when they came back, they're like, I'm so glad you came back. Your show was my alignment time. Why did, so they were happy to have their alignment time back.
Yeah. And so then it wasn't until, again, this person came into my office and they said, hey, by the way, she's back. And I was like, oh my God, thank God. And then now I have to meet her. So one of the things that you're doing is you're doing this C-School. Mm-hmm. Right. But you did a live event and now you're launching it. So can people join C-School right now? I know you're going to make it evergreen after this month and they're not going to have the one-on-one calls, but can people join it?
Yeah. I mean, right now we're in module 3 or 4. So I think 4 out of 5. So it's very towards the end. They still can email if they'd like to, but they're also encouraged to join once the evergreen's available. So it's up to them. They're if they joined literally now today as we're speaking, they would get the end tail of it in terms of the live experience, the end tail of the live experience. But the evergreen, always available content will be available shortly, in a few weeks after this course ends. So basically, I would say, as always with everything, listen to their inner intuition. And if their intuition feels it's a fit at whatever point, whether it's now or later, they're welcome to reach out or join.
Right. And so then you came up with this idea of these flash classes, which I think are such a fabulous idea. And the reason I really like this idea is in part because I believe in cutting the fat. And I feel like so many people in media, in our world, there's all this you have to send an email 15 times when you're going to sell your online course. And there's this whole business end to it. And I'm I can't concentrate on my spiritual life if I'm doing all this crap.
Well, there's
a time thing for me.
Yeah, well, it's a difference of, is the mind approaching the situation, or is the body of felt experience? So,
Okay, so explain that a little bit more to me.
well, I mean, the mind can make a plan and implement it, and there's nothing wrong with that if there's alignment within the joy of the unfolding of the plan. But if there's ever a moment where the restriction of flow, joy, energy, and alignment is happening, that process or plan is no longer actually serving that person.
So that sort of brings the question, do you continue to do something or push through something that is making you feel like, ugh?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's interesting you say that, because I would ultimately kind of say no. However, I looked at C-School as an interesting example of a situation where I created a curriculum in a spirit of inspiration. And then throughout the development of it, pre-sold the tickets to Sydney for the live event, and then had a shift of consciousness I never would have expected in my entire life to experience. So then I went from teaching a curriculum and developing a curriculum around the mind to wanting to go beyond it so desperately I'd rather die than stay on the planet without access beyond the mind. Like, literally, that's where I was at that point. And so then I was like, shit, now I'm supposed to go teach people how to be in the mind. That's just where I just was. I'm no longer there. How can I deliver content that's no longer authentic to who I am now? And then I did it because they had bought tickets. We'd already put deposits down. There was no stopping the train. It was so far along the tracks that the unfolding of it continued, but my experience evolved as well. And so what was ironically most fascinating was the flow of that experience. I was sitting there every day going, I want to get beyond the mind. I want to get beyond the mind. I don't want to sit and think about the mind. What am I doing to these people? I'm just bringing them more in their minds. And then I was like, well, I had to go through this stage that I'm now creating content for so that I could get to the place I'm at now. So in a way, maybe I'm taking them on a journey that I might personally be a little bit beyond now, unexpectedly, but they too can have this as an opportunity. But at the same time, my authenticity is so apparent that when I was with them but the hiatus and all of the things, I was upfront. I said, this is no longer where I'm at, but that doesn't mean that you're not. And that doesn't mean I can't serve you in this way. And showing up in those 2 days teaching. Ironically, what I'd never in the mind could have prepared or expected was that by presenting the content for those 2 days, after spending all these days living alone, like with my eyes, staring at my eyelids and doing all this, stuff to get out of my head, teaching in front of 60 people that had come from around the world to work with me got me more out of my head than all of the weeks alone. And so it was actually just like, ironically for you, I agree, Eckhart totally resonates as a teacher more to me than Michael Singer. Not that Michael's not at the same level of realization as Eckhart, but the content, the way Eckhart delivers it resonates more personally. However, the surrender experiment that Michael Singer shares of his whole life, at that new stage I was then in, I understood what he says when he says that he kept wanting to go alone in the woods and be enlightened alone in the woods. And then the universe kind of unfolded around him so that he had a spiritual retreat center alone in the woods. And he had his own, what became a $1 billion company alone in the woods. And he said he kept resisting this unfolding of people coming to him and this all happening around him because he just wanted to be alone in the woods in enlightenment. And he said at some point there was a shift where he realized that the work that was happening around him helped him get out of his head more than all the time alone in the woods. And so it was like he kept saying that he wanted this thing, and the universe was kind of showing him this is the most direct route to it. It's just not what he expected. The same has been showing up for myself as well. The more that I share on this stuff and teach it, the more I'm actually getting the selfish desire I've wanted all along, which is to be out of my head.
So what some positive psychologists or psychologists in sort of any sort of mindset field call that is the flow state. Right. And you talk about flow. You have a course on flow with intention, but that's literally when you
channel it. Just call it flow, call it channeling, call it whatever you want.
Right. So when you're sitting there, like for me, sometimes when I'm writing or when I am with a patient, it's a really amazing session that we're having and it's deep, or you're teaching or presenting or whatever you're doing, these conversations even, you can get into this like really beautiful flow state where time ceases to exist. Is that what you mean when you say, I want to get out of my mind? Because I hear you say this phrase now a lot, and I'm like really curious what you mean by that.
So it started initial start was, I got really into Abraham Hicks's teachings, as everyone that listens to my show knows. And I started notice like the sheer exposure to Esther Hicks speaking through the Abraham or channeling Abraham, I could get a really clear read on like where Esther was, where Esther started and stopped, and where Abraham's perspective started and stopped. And not just Esther, any human's perspective started and stopped, and Abraham's perspective. And I just exposed myself so much for so long, so solely to that point of view, of that expanded perspective. My own perception of reality shifted to identify and resonate more with the point of view of Abraham than humans. I still was in a human form and limitation in mind, but I understood all of that from the vantage point, no longer as the identified human, but as the frustrated human, knowing its own limitations based on this other broader point of view. And so it's kind of like, if I use an analogy, it's like a kid. When I was a kid, this is a way to describe it. When I was a kid, I was the oldest child, and I always wanted to hang out around my aunts and my mom talking. I didn't want to hang out with the kids. I wanted to be in the adult room, listening and overhearing and contributing if I had anything to offer at like 11, 12 years old to the adult conversation. I wanted to hang out with them. Now, wasn't I adult? No. Had I even gone through puberty at that point? No. But there was something about that conversation that was really appealing to me more than being where I actually was at, which was in the child form or that prepubescent teen era. So the same thing is how I feel or felt about this work, was that the Esther, to get to this Abraham perspective, just meditated. She got outside of her head. Her mind was not doing the work. And I just thought, well, she's living a pretty great life, and she's channeling infinite intelligence that's infinitely better than any human mind I've ever heard speak on any subjects to humans before. I thought, I want to do that. I want to provide real value for people. And what I felt was real value was this expanded channeled perspective. Like, it can't be the human mind that does this. It needs to be an entity above a human that needs to come through a human's mind. That was the initial thought. And I just came to the logical conclusion that the mind was really limited, and I could only do so much. Esther could only do so much, but Abraham could do far more. How can I do that? So that was this initial idea, but then I let it go because no one's talking about that. In our society today, intellectualism and being intelligent, whether it's artificial or your baby getting as smart as baby IQ can make it, to go to the whatever schools and preschools and whatever. Humanity is obsessed with intelligence, but I was already bored with it. I already recognized its limitations and was completely uninterested in developing it further. And for many months, it just went unexplored because I didn't have anyone talking about that. So I just kind of continued.
You never felt like at that point, there's also like this idea of someone who's channeling, like another way to put this is like someone who's like an angel channeler.
Yeah,
right?
Any of that stuff, I was fascinated by anyone channeling intelligence that was not human.
Because I've interviewed angel channelers, like mediums. I know one of the most incredible sort of channelers I know sells real estate in Florida, and like she can just call me and say things, and I'm like, there's no way you should know that, and she has information that she can't explain. But did you feel like you had no one to talk to about that, or that it was going to be really like you had sort of put on the back burner your ability to actually channel those kinds of things as well? Because most of the channelers I know feel like anyone can develop it and we can all tap into it, and they're not special. They just have this sort of gift, and they're on, like you are, a mission to help people kind of bring it down.
Yeah. Well, I think I can skip forward a little bit. And then about 6 months later, after that initial desire to go beyond the mind, recognizing its limitations, but not having anywhere to go with it, I flowed into a channel that talked about the end of the mind, the last era of the mind. And I was like, ooh, spiked my interest, because I was like, that's what I wanted, but no one has said anything about that, especially in human form. So then then it was what I realized. I was like, what's beyond the veil? Like, what's beyond the curtain of that? And not just in an Esther Abraham situation, but in a channeling situation, but just living beyond the mind. And it was enlightenment. And then I was like, oh crap, that's for Eckhart Tolle. That's for Buddha. That's for Jesus. That's for Michael Singer. That's for the Buddhists and the people in the ashrams. That's not for Jess Lively that likes millennial pink and stays in beautiful Airbnbs traveling the world. That's not for someone that doesn't that's not for someone that uses Instagram as often as I do. That's not for someone that likes and appreciates beautiful restaurants. It's not for me. I can't do that. I'm not old. I'm not wise. I'm not dead. Like I kind of looked at those, or I'm male. Like those are the categories.
Yeah, I hear.
And then I thought, and then two other elements occurred to me. One was that, well, I couldn't deny my own desire to get beyond my mind and to stop thinking so hard, because I was efforting my thought as much as I used to effort my actions before. And so there was kind of that desire to stop that efforting, but also, I heard a perspective that I really loved it was actually about the idea of channeling other entities and specifically aliens, but it could kind of apply to almost any entity that's not a human. And the point of view said, what the humans need is not more aliens channeling to humans, even though they have a different perspective for humans than humans have, as an example. They're not a realized master. They're not an enlightened being just because they're an alien. Now, this is speaking not necessarily to Abraham, which may not be at that same frequency, but the point was that the humans need more humans that are realized on stage. So that was really interesting, because I was in this phase where I was like, I need to have Joe or some other entity coming through me like Esther and Abraham. I can't just be myself.
I see what you're saying.
I can't be wise. I can't be beyond my own mind. So I got to go outsource it to something bigger than myself. And that point, I realized this enlightenment, which humans very rarely have gone through, but I think that's shifting in the decades to come, that enables someone to channel information. And I'm now like you, what we said in the beginning, we're very unlikely to define or say we know anything. I can't say with any certainty where the inner voice that people are tapping into with 100% certainty is coming from. They can obviously ask that voice within themselves, but I think there's many ways of defining it, describing it, or actually many different possibilities that they might be receiving. So it's impossible to say, if someone does the inner voice work that I work with people to do, what they're going to get. They could get an entity that's an angel. They could get an Abraham-like frequency. I know there's a medium that, like Anthony Williams, that channels compassion.
Yes,
spirit. I know him. And so it's like, it's too hard. Or people could just get their own higher self, or like, and what even is that really? I don't know. But I do know, like all those channelers you've said, that they can get something. And so what I've realized is, I took the hiatus saying I'm not enlightened, and I did kind of open myself up to the possibility that there was no denying that was the only thing that was appealing to me for the future.
Is being is to be enlightened?
Not to be enlightened. No, is to go beyond the mind. But when I was told that because I didn't know what that meant. So like I said, I left it alone. But once I found someone describing that experience of going beyond the mind, I was so fascinated. What's behind the curtain? What's behind the door? And then I heard it was enlightenment. I shut it down initially because that didn't seem like it was for me. But at the same time that I felt like it wasn't for me, I also knew nothing else would do. Like staying in the mind wasn't going to cut it either. So then I thought, well, not that I will ever in this lifetime or I do believe it's inevitable for everyone that in some lifetime they will do that. They will have that realization. And in nonlinear time, they already have. So it doesn't really matter. We're just kind of experiencing this until we get there, and then we'll experience it. But we already are experiencing it in nonlinear time in this life or some other. But I don't know if it's going to happen to Jess Lively, this entity that's already a past life in a nonlinear reality. But I can tell you, if, for example, someone like a Jess Lively, even if it's someone else with a different show or a different, like if there was a woman in her 30s that had some experience like this, that liked millennial pink and all the things that go against all of the stereotypes I've seen done before, I would believe it was possible for me. But before that, I was like, this is not something I can attain. I don't look, sound, act, or am interested in the things. I thought you needed to be someone that wanted to be alone in the woods, like a monk.
It's so interesting what you're saying, though, because for me, when I had my spiritual awakening happened very, very quickly, and it is very wrapped up into, it's a longer conversation, but about the guilt I have over recommending psychiatric medication to people over a long period of time, and the addiction rate in this country, and how I really feel like I was trained in a certain way. And then I had this spiritual awakening and this sort of like, holy shit moment. Like, what have I done to people and my whole life? And I didn't want to be in service. P.S., which is kind of funny I say that, because besides having an MFA, I then got a social work degree, and social workers are in service. Like that's what we do. It's you're not choosing a job. It's a vocation, right? It's a calling. You're called into the work. But I still was convincing myself, oh, I'm not in service. I don't want to be in service, because I knew people in service and they were kind of crazy. And I was like, my whole life will be about this stuff that I'm doing. And then the day, of course, happens once you say it to the universe, like, I don't want that. They're like, ha ha, very funny. Like, this is probably going to happen to you. And I remember the day I woke up and my feet hit the ground and I was like, okay, now I'm in service. My spiritual awakening happened so fast. And I wrote this book called My Death Year on it. And, you know what's so strange about it is that I really struggled with writing the word enlightenment, because this goes back to the beginning of our conversation. I was like, it's about like okay, if we have a path to enlightenment, but I'm like, who the F am I to say that I'm more enlightened than anybody else?
I don't believe there is a path, personally.
Well, or no. And I also think that this whole concept of like who's enlightened, I just felt like so bad saying I'm more enlightened than anybody else, even though I was living from a perspective of, again, like I'm the kind of the face of the transgender movement on Fox News, which is bizarre, right? But if there's a story about it, I'm the girl that they call, or a lot of like gender topics and sort of things that we're talking about now in terms of the Me Too movement and feminism. The thing that I never say on air on Fox is that I don't really see gender because I don't really see people, right? So my close friends know this, and people who listen to my podcast know this, but like, I know you're a separate human being, you're a separate entity from me, but if we're all energy, I'm way at the place of like, just because I'm in this body right now and it's a female body, like I totally understand why hundreds of thousands of more people every single year are saying that they're non-binary. Like that completely makes sense to me, and why so many people are coming out now to be on the spectrum in terms of sexuality, and especially going from like heterosexual to bisexual relationships or lesbian relationships, because there's a fluidity now that just didn't exist before. And part of that happens with the awakening. I know I'm talking to somebody who knows all of this already, but then you start living in this world where I'm having a conversation. I know that person's separate from me, but I'm like, they're really not. We're just all energy and we're of the same body. We're just like in a separate form. And so for me, calling on different frequencies or other beings doesn't even feel strange, right? Like I don't necessarily know if I'm good at it, and I can shut down it, and I can like take the veil and put it down, because that's how we're told to function. And I kind of need to function as a mom, because I start living in that world, and you start to live what I call in like the other land a little bit too much, and I need to sort of ground myself. But it's just really interesting to hear you talk about this whole idea of enlightenment and tapping into that.
Well, I mean, to me, it is like Eckhart's analogy about plants blooming. So I got really into this. So what I've realized is the human mind cannot not be the mind. So as much as my mind wanted to go beyond itself, it was a dog chasing its tail. So it's just a thing that's going to unfold over time for myself. I'm certainly not there. I'm highly aware of that, because once you get to that point of closeness, I think, to it, not that I'm that close, but I'm closer than I've ever been personally before, I'm more hyper aware of my distance from it than ever before. Like the awareness enhances in all ways, and also the distance from it. You're like, there's no cheating yourself with like, well, maybe this is it. Like, no, like you are so aware that there's no way. So I feel, I don't know. Actually, I kind of lost where we were.
So no, that's okay.
Going with that. Yeah.
No.
But anyway, so I don't think that people can. I think it's a natural unfolding that will happen, like an apple falling from a tree. And you can have moments of satori, where I've had a few of those, and they're really wonderful to tap into the subjects and the aspects of it. But none of them have been withstanding. None of them have been lasting. They then become felt realization of concepts. It's kind of like, for a long time, I read about orgasms, and then one day I had an orgasm, and then I stopped having the orgasm. Now, I'll always remember what that experience of the orgasm was like. And before I had it, I always had a concept of what it was like, but I didn't know what it was like. Then I had it, I then knew it, but I also was aware every moment afterwards that I was not having an orgasm, because I had the orgasm to know I'm not staying in it. Now, to me, when we say the word enlightenment, besides a satori, the instant of it, just like an orgasm is an instant, the felt, extenuated, continual presence of that realization, that sustained orgasm, if you will, in this analogy, from the research I've done, happens spontaneously without the mind's choice or deliberation, and it happens through the larger aspect of ourselves. It's not the human mind or persona choosing to connect through the human persona. And then it happens like an apple falling from a tree. And I can tell you, I'm highly aware my apple has not fallen. But what I am also aware of is this teachers that have had that experience, what they're sharing about the condition previous, like how they're helping others that are still an apple hanging from the tree, even though they've fallen. I resonate so deeply in understanding now why they're speaking to those things, even though there's still concepts for anyone still hanging on the tree. It does release resistance and like momentary glimpses. And also at the same time, I've actually realized the path to realization, that being another word for enlightenment, like the best thing someone can do is none of the crap I've taught over 4 years of podcasting. It is now, well, like, I think that it's all a journey, and I think there are stages of it where you do clear things and you do take actions. But at this point, I can say it's compassion for the flaws of the human mind that will never undo themselves. And it's actually like a seed that a lot of times they say the word seed of enlightenment. Okay. A seed, when we're in the phase like I was in all my seasons before this season 5, what we're like is we are like a little seed that's not even aware it's in the dirt and there's crap going on around it. It's just not even, it's unconscious about itself. Then it recognizes I'm a seed, and it puts itself and it goes, and I'm in dirt and this is dirty and yucky and I don't want to deal with this crap. Literally crap, fertilizer. I don't want to deal with this. So it puts itself on a shelf and it varnishes itself over and over. It makes it as shiny as possible. It does all the processes. It goes to all the counseling. It goes to all the woo-woo spiritual circus things there are to do. And it just lacquers and veneers and lacquers and veneers. And it thinks and creates its own reality, and it manifests in it. You know, you could even put channeling in the outsourcing of information to other entities. You know, it does all these things. And the irony is the seed of enlightenment, when put in the ground and when not varnished and when left alone to decay, quote unquote, to be in its brokenness, breaks open, and the plant can go through the roots and the shoots come up from the top, and the seed is essentially destroyed. But it's not. It's transformed into a plant. But if you said, where's the seed? There's no seed left. There's just a plant. But that plant, as long as the seed is keeping itself away from the dirt and trying to varnish itself, trying to fix itself, trying, it will never allow itself to destroy, to break open.
Yeah. So, but that's such a beautiful, I hope everyone listens to this, because that was just such a beautiful description of this.
Nobody's described it that way, but I understand it so much more saying it that way than anything I've heard before.
Well, that's why, I mean, I was not on the path to enlightenment. Like I'm not saying I'm enlightened, but I was not on the path. Like I was not looking for it. I was not down the woo-woo rabbit hole. It was literally like, and I think a lot of people describe this where it's like you like open the door and you fall down a flight of stairs. That's exactly what happened. And actually, I didn't even open the door. Like somebody else did for me. And I was like, no, I don't think so. And then the next thing I know, I'm like doing ayahuasca, you know?
But that doesn't mean someone's enlightened. That's just an experience in the circus.
Yeah. Well, it is. Well, although I found it incredibly moving to do. I started doing things and exploring things that I never thought I would do. I
think that's a phase, but I think that's still definite. And personally, my experience of all of that phasing, which I've done as well, including ayahuasca, it's just as part of the spiritual circus. It's not necessary. It may be enjoyable and fun to do for a while, but it's far from the apple falling from the tree.
Yes, I agree because, well, for me, my experience of ayahuasca is very curative. Like I've gotten information that I wouldn't have known otherwise. Like stop using your cell phone so much, your ear is killing you. Like I didn't have that thought in like a conscious state. But when I do ayahuasca, it like tells me medical information about my body, which I find
that's the plant spirits. It's still not like you're. You know, I actually had a friend, speaking of this, I had a friend who did all the drugs, psychedelics to like hardcore stuff. And he eventually did, and he does massive amounts of them. So he did 1 liter of ayahuasca, which is insane. And no one should ever do that. I don't know how, but in his big finale of drug use, if you will, at this finale experience, he had had many amazing, mystical, unexplainable access points like telepathy and so many others. And so what the vision showed him in that final one was that every time he did an experience like that, a psychedelic basically, it would take him out and pull him back like going through a window. It would show him what's possible through the window, but then he had to come back. It would show him what's possible, then he had to come back. And the plant spirits told him, now you walk through the door. And that's the difference. That's the apple falling from the tree. Now you walk through the door. You're no longer living from this momentary insight that you get from a plant spirit in an altered state of consciousness. Your state of consciousness is altered, but it's not done by the mind. The altered state of consciousness is done by what is the greater aspect of our consciousness. So what's fascinating from my experience is that it's really now about not trying and letting go. And now I understand when they say surrender and they say let go. I now know they're saying let the seed break open. Let the mind worry itself to death. Let the things happen, because in that you're allowing the dissolution of something instead of trying to keep it safe and protected. Mm-hmm. You're not keeping it this precious being that it thinks that it is. It's as an identity, it feels it needs to protect itself. And as it stops protecting itself, it stops holding itself back from breaking open, like you said.
And so do you think, to go back to like a definition that you would have of enlightenment, if you could say a definition of enlightenment, from what I'm understanding is, if I have to reframe it back to you, is, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like it's a sustained experience of living outside the mind.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting is back when I was previous to this phase, I used to have a friend that really wanted enlightenment and I had zero interest in it. I was like, you go do that boring thing. I'm going to stay in this sandbox and manifest with my mind. And because I was obviously in the seed varnishing stage.
Right. You were like working on tapping into the intuition and like, yeah.
I just wanted to manifest with my thoughts. I wanted my thoughts to create my reality. And I wanted to choose with the human mind in me what my manifestations and what my creations would be. So my mind was in total control. The Buddhists call this phase egoic mastery or mind mastery. So in that phase, I used to say to my friend that wanted enlightenment, are you kidding? Like anytime you're in alignment with your inner being or that high state, you're in alignment, in enlightenment. Now, this is something I picked up, not because I made that up. That was like an Abraham Hicks quote. So I was kind of quoting them. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but I think and I'm not saying I haven't had satori's or moments of real experience beyond the mind. Yet where I think it goes kind of interesting is I think there's a phase that's not many humans have gone through to really speak to it. I think most people are either in the unconscious, they're in the dirt, but they're not aware of it. So they're just kind of being tossed around, but they're being trampled in the ground. They're not aware that they're in the dirt or that they're a seed that will become a plant. Then the seed becomes self-aware. It becomes aware. The mind becomes aware of the mind. The ego becomes aware of the ego. And then it tries to find its full expression. How far can I take this thing? And that's where most people are emerging into. That's that spiritual awakening. That's not the realization of enlightenment. That's not the apple falling from the tree. In between the opening to the spiritual circus and the exploration of all the esoteric and all the things the rational mind shuts down, what I think is what I'm finding and experiencing directly is there is a phase, and I don't know how long it will be. Everyone's experience of this is different. Just like when Eckhart says that in realization, another way of looking at enlightenment is like plants blooming. 114 million years ago, the first plant flowered. And that flower, it took a long time for another flower. That was the first one. There was plants, but no flower.
Right.
And so let's say that's Buddha.
Okay.
And then assuming he's the first one, he's the first documented one, we can say. And then Jesus, 500 years later, blooms. And then we get, and then he goes, but eventually, it was very rare at first, these flowers, but eventually the whole world
Was filled with flowers.
Was filled with flowers. Now, what's interesting about that is what we right now have is a tendency to look at individuals through a lens of Buddha, Jesus, Eckhart. We have like very limited perception. So we're like, okay, a daisy, a daffodil, and a rose. If you don't look, if your experience doesn't look like a daisy, a daffodil, or a rose, then it's not real. But that's just, so when an orchid comes along, they would not identify that as a flower. If you only saw and said enlightenment as a daisy, a daffodil, or a rose, and an orchid blooms, that would be rejected as possibly a flower because it exceeds the boundaries of what we've defined as a flower thus far. But imagine the proliferation. How many flowers are there? So I can't say to this phase what it will look like for everyone, but as a generalization, and I don't even think everyone's going to go through the spiritual circus the way you, like, by no means is doing ayahuasca a requirement. It's not a prerequisite for any of this stuff, you know? No. So like, it's, Eckhart Tolle was just miserable and wanted to kill himself at 29. Byron Katie was so miserable as a mother that she, not just because of her motherhood, she just was a miserable human that felt so miserable. She didn't feel like she deserved to sleep on the bed. And in a moment where a cockroach rolled over her leg in the morning, she had her moment. Her apple fell. Yeah. And so it's not definable. However, there are trends. And so some of the trends are possibly to go down the spiritual path and go down some of the esoteric for a period of time. But then I also think there's this other little stage that's lesser spoken about because it's lesser experienced. People, it's very fun to stay in the spiritual circus and think we're getting far. It's very fun to lacquer the shell. And you can spend your whole lifetime, if not many others, lacquering the shell in new and unique ways. I've loved the experience of it. It was highly aligning and so fun to do until I hit the wall. But then there's that period where I hit the wall.
I hit the wall after about a year. And for me, it was a little bit different because when I was trained, again, like my training where it did come in kind of handy, and sitting in a room for 20,000 hours listening essentially to people's souls has helped. Yeah. But this whole positive psychology of like thoughts and all of that stuff, it all just felt so mind-based to me. Like it's like part of me would read these texts, and it's some important studies coming out of Harvard and other places. And I was like, this is just a bunch of bullshit to me. Like, it always felt like, and again, like I love how you're saying it, like the spiritual circus. For me, that ended after about a year. And I was like,
Yeah. And then you just let the dirt fall on you. And then the dirt's fertilizing the seed. Well,
and then you kind of like, you're sort of like, again, you start like wandering the earth a little bit more to be like, okay, there's what's like the next phase. And you said something really beautiful as well on one of your last podcasts, which was you kind of hit this stage where you're like, what is after this? Like, why bother? I had a lot of that, like a lot of this, like what we normally attribute to teenagers going through an existential crisis. My existential crisis was like, well, now because I felt like high a lot, like I felt pretty high. And I was like, wow, if I feel this way, and this is very sober. I've done ayahuasca twice. I don't do any other drugs. I barely drink. Was definitely a feeling of like, what's beyond, like, okay.
Have
like
you
now
had
what?
Like have you had the
falling
permanent enlightenment?
Well,
I definitely have not. I'm highly aware. There's no kidding myself whatsoever to even think that would be this realization.
What I'm loving about this conversation is that, like, no, but see, I don't think I'd ever, and I don't know, maybe this will change as I get older. And I think you're really challenging some really, huge sort of societal stereotypes that we have about enlightened people, because I think you're right. Like, what is the model for a female enlightened creature? And
Byron Katie's the only one, and Pema Chodron, perhaps.
And Pema, she's a monk though. Like, so it's like, well, is that like is a life I can't live, right? I can't go be a monk. I have 3 little kids, right? Like, that's not even in my. I do know a woman that's in Bali that's not famous, but she's enlightened as well, and she has a child as well, and it was a very difficult transition for her to go through as a mother. Yeah.
So, yeah. And it's not easy, but it's possible.
But like, I think maybe we have sort of some instances of it when we look at someone like Gabby Bernstein, who's very like knee deep in the spiritual world, and she's a spiritual.
I wouldn't call her enlightened.
No, I wouldn't. But I think that she's giving a vision of something like she's in that spiritual world enough to me where, I don't know, it's so commercialized. Like everything's so commercialized. I guess what I'm struggling with is like, what would it look like if one of us.
But to me, okay, to be honest, this is what I'd say. That's mind BS. Like, who cares? You would just be it. You wouldn't be wondering what it would look like because you'd be so in the felt realization of the experience that to even ask the question is the indication we're not there.
Well, right. And that's what you were saying, which is like, I like pink and like millennial pink or whatever. And I'm like on Instagram, like, can somebody who's enlightened be on that stuff? And when you said that,
it will no longer be a question,
right? But when you said that, I was like, why not? Like, why? Of course you could be. But I guess my ego is at such a place where I would feel very uncomfortable ever being called enlightened or ever. Like I still.
That's because the mind that's just the mind projecting. Like, of course it would. And like, it don't work. That doesn't make you humbly false or true or anything. It's just the mind, of course, would have that. That's just the mind being itself. And that's where our awareness is directed more to that perspective than the totality of who we are.
But does someone like Eckhart Tolle or Buddha or anybody ever say that they're enlightened? Like, I'm an enlightened being?
I would actually look at that as one of those facets of the flowers. We have the daffodil, we have the rose and the daisy, right? We have three. We have so few. And right now there is a story in the human mind that says if someone says they're enlightened, they're not. That's just a story. We haven't had enough. I'm sure there will be a flower out there that at one point, and Eckhart does say he is the one that teaches basically about enlightenment. I can say, like, there's no question whether Eckhart is, and he teaches on this subject extensively. So I can't say, is there a quote where he says, I am enlightened? But he's even in the book, I've read it enough times to say he read all the spiritual texts after years later, read the spiritual text and realized he had the experience that they were describing. So I guess the most direct way I've heard him share it is that. But I think it's actually one of the rumors or one of the stories of our humanity, the mind, that's like, oh, well, if you're enlightened, you would never explain it. To me, once you had that felt realization of an orgasm, would you ever deny that you had an orgasm? To me, it would be ridiculous to assume that if you've had an orgasm, you would say later, I've never had an orgasm. If you're having a sustained orgasm, no less. You're having a sustained orgasm, you're like, I've never had an orgasm. And anyone that says that they have, hasn't. And I think that's ridiculous. But do I think that people who have thought in their minds that they've been enlightened because they thought they had an orgasm, they got really, I'm sure there are people that are presenting that are false at it, but I don't think there's anything wrong with being authentically in truth of that either. I don't think that that's a sign that someone's not in it. There's a possibility that exists that someone would say they've had it.
So then it goes back again to the definition of like, what is enlightenment?
Yeah.
And so
and who really cares?
So, but when you say like if someone's enlightened or not, or someone says that they're enlightened or not, is it for you? Do you imagine it to be? Because you're not, you don't think you're that.
Very well put. I have to imagine what it would be.
Do you imagine it to be that sustained feeling of what?
I think it would be a sustained. I still think that the mind remains an active part of our lives. So I don't think that the individual persona that is the mind goes away. Kind of like, think about it this way. I actually just today had this realization of a way of imagining this. So I'm sure with your journey in the spiritual circus, you came around the Taurus wheel. Did you hear about the Taurus, your aura or your energy field? So anyone else, it's like, what is she talking about? Just imagine Glinda the Good.
Oh, no. I did a whole podcast on it. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So they know what it is. So if you don't know what a Taurus wheel is, it's electromagnetic fields that's surrounding yourself. Now, if you don't know what that sounds weird. Just imagine Glinda the Good Witch with her little bubble.
That was what happened to me. I would see light in the room. I would see light. But this was years ago. And then it wasn't until I was at this spiritual meeting with this guy in Brooklyn and in the Flatiron with all these doctors. And he said, did anybody see the light change in the room? And nobody said anything. And I did, and thought I was going to throw up in a trash can. And again, like, I went up to him afterwards and he said, "Did you see the light change?" And I said, "Yes." And I went and drank by myself at a California pizza kitchen because I'm not even a drinker, because I was so confused at sort of what had happened. And then like you start talking about energy and light and like that. And I don't see it all the time. It's not like I walk around and I can see people's auras. No.
And I don't know that like to be enlightened, you'd have to.
No.
I don't actually think you need to be enlightened to see that. I think that's just
something that
some people are sensitive to. Like channeling, yes. I don't think that everyone that's channeling is enlightened.
Right.
So it's an experience. Like you can have an extrasensory perception, but that doesn't mean you have a permanent state of realization.
Or a paranormal experience and not have a permanent state of realization. I like how you said that.
Yes, a permanent state of realization of your connection to all that is. But so now let's just imagine this torus wheel. So we're a torus wheel within a universe. If you think of the universe like a snow globe, it's one object if you look at it as a snow globe, and it's 10,000 objects if you look at every flake of snow. Now, that's like when Lao Tzu talks about the 10,000 things. It's one thing that becomes the 10,000. So you can say the one thing is the snow globe, or the 10,000 are the little specks of dust or snow floating around. Now, what I believe from this is me as a mind doing the best I can to explain something I've never experienced before. So let me put that on the table.
Yeah.
Again, that you're not in it.
No, but Jess, this is what's so important about the work that you do, is that because when I was going through this, I did not feel like there was a language with which to interpret my experience. And maybe that's what we're saying. Like language starts to drip away because it's very difficult to describe these things, but it really does help.
It's just only helpful to the mind.
Yeah.
It's completely unnecessary because the apple will fall from the tree in this life or another. But this is just the experience.
It's very comforting. It's very comforting.
It is nice. So here, imagine that we're the snow globe. The universe is the snow globe. Now, the felt realization of all things in the one life that you truly are, like Eckhart's experiencing, he experiences himself as this snow globe. But we are experiencing ourselves as the minds in a snow globe. So we're minds in a universe, or entities, personas in a universe. So we personify ourselves as the flakes of snow. He is more in his awareness connected. Here we go. His awareness. What we really are, as I'm like taking all of the boundaries out and going, I don't really know, but I can say after all of this, we're the awareness that there is a thought in our mind, and we're the awareness that there is a peace in our hearts and our guts, and we are aware that we can listen to both perspectives. But are we the mind or are we the inner voice? I would say likely not, but the awareness of both voices is most what I can pin down to our persona. I am that I am is what Abraham was told when he asked God what he is. I am that I am. That's not I think, therefore I am. That would be the mind creating a persona that doesn't, and Eckhart says that's the fatal flaw of our recent civilization, is Descartes. Like, I think, therefore that's why I exist. I exist. And at times I'm in a form where I have a mind that's thinking, but that's just an organ. Like I am an awareness that sometimes has a body. And when I have a body, my heart pumps blood because the body has a heart that pumps blood. But the mind is not more than an organ in the body. But right now it believes it is all that all the awareness in a physical form of human right now is dominated by the mind projecting a false sense of separateness from the snow globe. Mm-hmm. So it's the snowflake thing. I'm the snowflake and you're that snowflake, and you might hit me in the moving of if you're shaking the snow globe around, and I need to protect myself so I don't get hurt if your snowflake hits mine. The awareness that is the snowflake aware of itself as intrinsic. There's no space between the snow and the water in the snow globe and the glass and the base. Like, it's all touching each other. So the awareness of the snowflake, that it is touching all the things that all want, and it can feel that connection through, because what permeates a snow globe, just like every other object in our universe, is space, is emptiness, is stillness. And that is what, even if we look at this whole analogy of a snow globe, if you dial that down just as much as you do our actual bodies, you get to emptiness in space. And so that snowflake in the thing, for me, the realization I believe to be that there is a greater awareness. If we can hear the mind and the inner voice, or we can be aware of our individuality or the connection to the entire snow globe, the awareness is more dominated in an enlightened state by the aspect that is connected to everything and peaceful than the mind. That doesn't mean the mind stops functioning, but it does mean it's now no longer on a pedestal that is running the awarenesses, choices, decisions, emotions, and experiences in its totality, like it has been.
And if I have had sustained experiences where I do feel not just like connected to people like I did when I was a kid or a teenager or an early adult or my children when they were born. It was all after this over the last, definitely started when I opened the door to spirit and then like fell down the rabbit hole again. And then it starts to blend into everything. Like I do feel sustained, like it's going to sound so crazy. I don't give a shit, but I feel absolutely connected to the desk. Like I am like almost as if we're all water.
Yeah. No, I've had a moment of that, but I have not had a sustained experience of it.
And it's strange because what happens to me, I can tell you, is that I would say I'm about 50-50. So for example, I'll be talking to my kid's soccer coach, and as he's talking to me, I'm in my head going, we're the same. Like you're love, I'm love. We're the same human being. We're like all connect. Like it's not necessarily shows up as a visual. It's more of like a feeling of that there's no separation between him and I. I don't even know his first name. It doesn't, and for me, this starts to blend into a conversation about love. Like really, like this sense of incredible love that I have for everything around me.
Great.
But I have to check that because then this is where I start to struggle with this idea of like living in a state of enlightenment. You start to feel a bit high. And I don't, for me at least personally, I don't know what it would feel like. Like I would have to, what I'd want to do it. My nature would tell me if I could, if it was allowed in the world in which I live right now with the responsibilities that I have, the way the world is set up, I would want to put on robes and live like Pema. Right. I very much desire to live in a state like that all the time.
Really? I don't at all.
See,
that's so
do.
Interesting. But that's beautiful because some people are drawn to it.
Well, I do until I don't. Right? Like I have this idea that this would be beautiful and like I would really want to live like that. And I don't care about material things and that stuff isn't important to me, except for the fact that, again, and this goes back a little bit to the conversation we started out with, which was I also, want to function in the real world. And,
yeah, I don't think that enlightenment will always take an isolated form.
No, but I think we have a lot of sort of stories around that it has. And for me, it's like then you start living in the borderlands a little bit.
Well, it makes sense that it needed to in the past. The energies were so different in the past. For those people that get out of mass consciousness and to really unhinged from a lot of the attachments that the human mind and psyche has together as a collective and so forth, of course, it'd be far easier to go into the wild and do it in the woods. However, it's also easier to be enlightened if you have no one around you rubbing the seed. Like there's like, it's not actually easier. I don't know, but it is in a way, it's a different set of situations. Eckhart says, I wrote this, he said, putting a plant, you can make a beautiful plant in a greenhouse with all of the right conditions and all the right soil and all the right stuff. But for that plant, if you took it after it's bloomed in this beautiful way out into the nature and you put it against the elements, that plant could soon wither and die. So he was making this assumption. He goes, the idea is not to go to an ashram. Not that you can't. And if you want to, you should go. But he was saying, the idea is not to go to an ashram because, there's not a lot of worries there. You can have your free food. You can get your fresh food delivered. You get a massage, but it's not necessarily sustainable in other elements or conditions. So those states can go very deep and they can be very wide, but do they last in challenge? That would be an aspect of what I believe the real, more permeating experience of realization in the present moment would be felt like. But that's just my mind projecting.
And also, no. And also the as much as like my inner being, this I'm talking about my human form now, wants to go sort of live in that ashram in a way, there's also a huge part of me that can't feel love in the same way I do if I'm not functioning around and doing this kind of stuff and teaching and working and having these kinds of conversations. So I don't know if I'm articulating it all well, but that's sort of, there's always this sort of like duality at play where, part of it is just making a living as well. Like if money was no object.
I think you're just it sounds like from what you're sharing, it sounds like you teeter-totter between aspects of it and then getting back in, which is totally natural as a seed unfolds.
Well, and also it's talking about this phase that a lot of people don't talk about. Right, which is exactly what you're saying. And it seems like you're entering into the same phase, right? Where you're in this phase where it's like there's like what I love to call, there's this line at the end of, what's the movie with Brad Pitt? Legends of the Fall. And they talk about like he seemed like he had one foot here and one foot in the other world, and they live within the borderlands. And so I often meet people who I feel like I would describe Eckhart Tolle as like someone who lives a little bit in the borderlands to me. And that for me is like that stage of enlightenment. Like you're human, you're here, but you're living in the borderlands. And I always say to people, like when I start going down this path or I start to feel this feeling overwhelmingly all the time, for, let's say, sustained for a week, I'm like, oh God, I'm scared because I feel a little bit borderlandy. Now, I would never describe it as enlightenment because then I feel like my ego's getting involved and like all this stuff and like what's enlightenment and the more I love.
Because there's fear.
Right.
The fact that you said there's fear in there, of course not.
Right. Exactly. Because, if you're totally enlightened, then there's no
fear. I'm afraid I could get in. I love how Eckhart explained this so simply. He said in a relationship chapter, the relationship question is a relationship with yourself in order to have a good relationship with the partner. And he said the fact that you have a relationship with yourself is the root of all of your problems.
Right.
The fact that you have a me to have a relationship with is the root of all problem. And when that is gone, when there is not two, there is only one. That is the realization. So
just because I know I could talk to you for hours and hours. One thing that you're going to address, and I'm really excited, and I'm so curious to see, is you said that it's all going to be about releasing the resistance. So I think any resistance would be like a squash bug. Right. Well, in the overwhelming tides of peace. Right. Well, and so you said season 5 is going to be about sort of this idea that you've come this far, you want to live beyond the mind as much as possible. So what is the resistance? Like if there is resistance, I think that's how you said it. Or when you're working with the clients, like what's the resistance that's coming up for them? But will that be where season 5 goes for you? A bit. Yeah. So basically what I'm helping people do is like, I was kind of like, well, I took the hiatus saying I have nothing in my mind left to offer anyone else. I'm still stuck in it just as much as anyone else. And I don't want to listen to any other human mind speak. So I don't want to listen to myself speak or help people either. Because I know that I have too much limitation. I can't really do my best and highest for them. So I took the break. What I realized is that for me, the selfish desire to get out of my mind was achieved through helping people. Yes. But then what coincided and coalesced along with it was this inner voice work that I've been doing since my early 20s or mid 20s, but not putting at the forefront of my message and the forefront of all of my work. I always referenced it, but I did not put people in the chair, make them shut up and do it. And so when I told people they could do it, it was just like every channel that's ever, like you said everyone can do this, or Eckhart saying everyone can do this, or Jesus saying, they all say you can do it. What I've realized is no one I have ever come across, and I read a lot of stuff, has ever just shut up and made the person do it. And so I was like, look, right now, most people are not going to be enlightened now. In decades to come, I do think these people are going to unfold in that way. But now, like myself, most people are not there. So what I can help them do in this dirty period of the dirt just falling on us is become aware of the awareness and bobble down, as I call it, I help them identify more as a bobblehead toy that has a spring in the neck and can go up into the head or down into the gut or the heart. And so if you look at a bobblehead that goes up and down, what I want them to do and what I can do myself, even though I'm in the head most of the time the neck spring is up. That's not enlightenment to me. To me, the neck spring being really, really locked down
is that version of enlightenment, but it can sometimes come up, but then it goes back down. Right now, most people are living in permanently up, and then it stays like this the rest of their lives. Like that, they're mostly up. What I want them to do is get a really, really loose neck and really, really detach from the identification as much as they can within the identification of the mind. I want them to learn how to bubble down in all possible time, shapes, and sizes for whatever amount that they can. It's not that they need to become an apple and tear themselves off of their tree. Their inner being will do that for them naturally. But in the meantime, it's kind of another way of looking at the apple is learning how to sway. It's learning how, and that is loosening the attachment to the tree that the mind is holding on to so tightly. It's holding on so tightly to mass consciousness. And as it bobbles or as it sways, eventually the weight of that gravity of the natural unfolding will happen. I can just say, it sounds like you may be further along than me on this path, because I am for sure, though, having had many deep, a handful, not many like you, a handful of deep experiences. Those 6 experiences that I've had are so quantumly far from my daily experience of life, given even my very quantumly very massively aware state. I'm massively aware of the mind, not massively aware of the felt realization of those states. So you definitely seem like you're further along in the path, and I commend you for it.
Oh, well, I mean, I can only speak.
Oh, you can't, but I can't even commend you, honestly, because it's nothing you did. So I can't give you, Nell, any credit for it, because it's just the soul of you coming through you. It's not anything that you could have done other than that bobbling, other than that weaving and opening up, but that's about it.
And I think that I'd be interested to talk to other people who are psychotherapists or people who've done because psychotherapy is a form of ministry, really, at its core, at least the way I've always worked, even though I haven't practiced from a religious perspective. There's some sort of hazing, for lack of a better word, that happens to you as a human being when you sit knee deep in people's souls for over a decade, 40 hours a week. You're listening to them expose themselves, and you're talking about these things, not with a stack of books on the table. Like I let go of reading that literature the day I left school. It's all through that experience of sitting with other people and saying, I don't know, I have a couch and they have a couch. I don't sit in a chair and they sit on the couch. We're equal beings in this room. I've always practiced from that way. I don't know why. It just felt more natural to me. And there's a table in between us. Let's just throw out your stuff on the table and see if we can start to, as I say, sift for gold, right? We're just constantly sifting in this river and seeing what gold nuggets arise. And so you start to come to some conclusions about things. And I don't know. And then again, just through my own life experience, adding to that, it's opened me up to this place of definitely having a broken open moment at 40. I mean, 40 was a shit show. It was really, really, when Eckhart Tolle said he went through this period and then you sit on a bench for almost, I didn't work for almost 3 months. I literally sat, and my mom would come over and she'd be like, are you going to go back to work? And I'd be like, I don't know if I can. I don't know how to function in this state.
Because you were in such a blissful state?
Yeah, I would describe it as very quickly, a blissful state, and just a massive realization that there's no separation between myself and the universe and other people, and what is gender and what is sexuality, and I've always lived a conventional heterosexual life, so I'm talking from that perspective. But that's why I'm really curious to have some really deep conversations with women who have crossed over sexually that I haven't had yet, with people that I find really intelligent. Because in all the past life regression therapy and all that kind of stuff, again, that, playing in that, what you call the sandbox, or playing with the woo-woo for a little while. I did that for a year. And the hard spiritual work is actually functioning in your modern day life the way you need to when you feel this sustained level of love.
There you go. That's beautiful.
And also it doesn't have to do with how much I meditate. P.S. I wish it did.
Yeah. No.
Meditation, staring. That's why I really resonated also when you said staring at my eyelids. I'm that helps for sure give me space to reacting to things around me that irritate me. But it doesn't have to do with all the meditation.
I don't think it has to do with the apple falling from the tree.
No.
It's just but it is a little respite from being stuck up in the head. But it's not a permanent state of anything.
Yeah. Jess,
it's just a moment. Yeah.
You're absolutely amazing. You're so amazing. I hope that this goodbye is only to say hello again. And I really hope that our paths cross in person at some point, because I certainly have an enormous amount to learn from you. You're such.
I feel like you're further. I'm just still stuck in the mind. You're the one that's having more of the self-realization.
I'm just explaining my experience, because if you saw me in 2 hours yelling at my kids to get in the car, you'd be like, "There's nothing enlightened that this does not look like love, right?" I don't walk around in the state of it doesn't for me. It doesn't work that way. But it's very visceral when I feel it. It's very, very visceral. It's a very beautiful, visceral experience. What I can say, though, is that I still am. I interviewed Gretchen Rubin yesterday, and she's driven by curiosity, and she's an intellectual, and I love her work. She draws on history and all that stuff. You're enormously curious, and that's a gift to all of us, because you share everything that you learn with. I'm going to cry. And it's not everyone's like that, and you give it away for free. A lot of it for free. What you learn and what you're doing in terms of your academic, intellectual work on this subject matter. And so you're a treasure. You're really a gift, and I'm very grateful to have crossed your path.
Well, thank you. That's really sweet, and I appreciate that very much. It's really my pleasure, truly. I only do things that are of my pleasure. So it's truly
me too, actually.
Alignment only. So I love that. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a joy to be here, and I'm glad to have met you too.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode of Unscripted with Nell Daly. If you could right now, we need you to head on over and review us on iTunes. As always, we will personally reach out and thank each and every one of you who do so, but we'd love your reviews, so tell us what you think. And you can always send us emails with either guests you want on the show or comments or questions. We're happy to get those, and you can find those on the website. Our contact information at nelldaly.com. To see all of my comings and goings, get updates on who our next guests are going to be, and if you just need a little bit of extra life advice or inspiration, come join me over on Instagram at Nell Daly. I use Instagram every single day. Or like us over on Facebook, and you'll automatically be following us, and that's at Nell Given Daily. That's also where you can watch us live. Before I end, I want to thank our audio editor, Walter Eggers, our video editor and co-producer, Paige McGovern, and our video production manager, Rick Endiver, co-producer, Corey Pakowski, and the rest of the Point Zero Media team. I couldn't do any of this without you. I couldn't. Of course, Teachable HQ, you guys rock. They're an amazing educational technology company. Check them out. I use them. Everybody big in the business uses them. They're just awesome. And a huge shout out of gratitude. Huge. The biggest to all the fans who are following the show. Just like I said last week, I am so humbled by how this is all going. Thank you. Until Monday, everybody, peace out. Have a fun and safe weekend. I love you guys already.